regiments of foot guards, their distinctive tunics, Welsh, Irish, Scots and Grenadiers, and the Coldstream Guards. And the Royal Engineers also in the procession. And this is the scene at Wellington Arch, which stands right in the middle of Hyde Park Corner. The ancient home of the Duke of Wellington nearby. Wellington Arch named because of that connection. At one stage the arch was planned as the main entrance to Buckingham Palace, but as with Marble Arch, things were changed at a later date. And this is where we will have a gathering of thousands of members of the armed forces for this final part of the ceremony in London, where the Queen's coffin will be transferred from that gun carriage to the state hearse, which will be waiting to take the Queen home to Windsor. Standing tall, just behind his father, the King, and a section of these young naval ratings. The Yeomen of the Guard, an important part of this procession for reasons of tradition, and then the Royal Company of Archers with their magnificent eagle feathers. King's bodyguard in Scotland. Deeply poignant moment in this procession as Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II approaches Buckingham Palace for the last time. This fine September day with touches of blue in the sky, The London skyline looking glorious in the background. And here we have what is, for the late Queen, a last glimpse of that famous balcony where she appeared on so many occasions, where she stood with her father and mother, King and Queen, at the end of the Second World War, cheered on by the vast crowds who were in the area we can see today. And the vast crowds again here when the young Queen was crowned back in 1953. Just ahead of the naval ratings were drawing the carriage. A very poignant moment for them, because members of the Queen's household, including her private secretary, part of this procession, now passing Buckingham Palace, their place of work, of course, along with Windsor and other royal residences, but Buckingham Palace was always the office. And here we have the staff of the palace. A great line of them standing in silence and respect as they wait for this procession to pass with the late Queen. And we think here of the four memorable Jubilees during the was taken in procession from Westminster Hall to Paddington Station. There was no service at Westminster Abbey. The service in full was at St George's Chapel, Windsor. And King George made the journey from London to Windsor by train, on the royal train, but arrangements this time are different, and the decision was made to take the Queen from London to Windsor by road in the Statehearse. Procession passing just on the left there, the great gardens of Buckingham Palace, where so many of those garden parties took place over the years, thousands of them. With so many people being delighted to be asked just what's most cases, to enjoy the gardens, and indeed, if they were fortunate, to have a few words with Her Majesty during the garden party itself. And then on the other side we have Green Park. Members of Her Majesty's household taking their part proudly in the procession. And still the sound of Big Ben tolling right across central London, punctuated with sounds of the King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery firing their long gun salute. And they've been based principally at Hyde Park for this firing today during this session. At Hyde Park. There are 2 guns also being fired at Hyde Park Corner, dismounted guns, as part of this last formal section of this procession today in London, before a separate procession takes place at Windsor later on. this part, Royal Air Force. Vice Chamberlain and the Treasurer of the Royal Household, part of this group representing those who served Her Majesty. A scene that will touch the hearts of everyone watching. Sure, as we look at the close family, children of the late Queen, led by the King, grandchildren, as they know full well that within minutes it will be the moment for the late Queen to leave London and to head back home to Windsor. London, of course, the city of the Queen's birth. And we are just a matter of a few yards away here from the Queen's childhood home on Piccadilly, and not too far either from her birthplace in Mayfair. Magnificent view of Wellington Arch, of the greenery, right in this busy part of London. And all the armed forces formed up for this final ceremony. Carriage will be taken under the arch, there, the transfer to the state hearse will take place. So many elements of strong tradition worked into the procession today. The piping party from the Royal Navy will pipe the still when the transfer is about to happen from the gun carriage to the hearse. A piping party that we heard at the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral last year. A very strong echo of the Duke of Edinburgh's life at sea. And of course, from the Queen's point of view, a tribute to her late father, King George VI, and his experience during the First World War at the Battle of Jutland. A very challenging experience at sea. And of course the Duke of Edinburgh himself with his wartime service in the Second World War. Imperial state crown and the orb and sceptre will be part of the procession, and that royal standard which is draped over the Queen's coffin all the way to Windsor until that final committal takes place in St. George's Chapel. And when those emblems of Her Majesty's authority will be set on the altar at St. George's Chapel before the committal takes place. Under the arch they go. Her Majesty's coffin on that carriage to be sheltered under that arch. The transfer will take place. Moments that few of us will ever forget, I'm sure. National anthem played as Her late Majesty was taken from Wellington Arch and is now on the way to Windsor after a very moving service at the Abbey and some clearly expressed messages, including those of the Archbishop of Canterbury, about the Queen's life of service and dedication and sense of duty. And then the magnificent, solemn, moving procession all the way from the Abbey to Wellington Arch. And there are crowds on the streets here approaching Knightsbridge, lots of them offering floral tributes, others just maintaining a dignified silence. Come to see their Queen for the last time as she leaves London. Katie Nicholl and Robert Hardman are still with me here in the studio looking at these scenes and have been watching the procession and the service before that. Katie, as we see the Queen's final departure from the capital, I suspect that these are the images that will stay with people for many years to come.
I don't think anyone that watched that, Hugh, will ever forget it. And you said during your commentary, so many memories, and that's what struck me as I watched that procession past those landmarks that have punctuated the Queen's life and punctuated ours, because we look forward to Trooping the Colour and those birthday parades. You know, I look at my life and it's been marked by the silver, the diamond, the gold, all these wonderful jubilees, and I can't help but think back to the Platinum Jubilee celebrations and the last time that the Queen stepped out on that balcony. And I think if anyone's wondering, what must she make of all of this? Remember when she stepped out for the last time, overwhelmed with emotion, that sea of faces, that sea of people there for her. Well, today they turned out again to bid a final farewell.
They did, Robert, and the sense of love and respect and admiration is just as strong as the sense of loss.
It is, Hugh. I thought it was rather touching. We saw just a few moments ago almost a ghost of a smile on the face of the King as he saw the end of this extraordinary ceremony, because it's been a spectacular and as we said earlier, unprecedented gathering of not just of world leaders but of all these armed forces from around the world. This is a ceremony unlike anything, really, as you said earlier, since the funeral of George VI, possibly since the coronation, and it's all gone exactly as the Queen would have wanted. She paid a great deal of attention to all of this, and she would have been so pleased to see it just go the way it's gone. And I think the wonderful contrast between the solemnity and the formalities we had a little earlier, and now just look at the capital coming out. I mean, they are 20, 30, 40, 50 deep in places, the whole of Hyde Park, and now this is the sort of on her way to the other part of all of this, which will be, I think, rather more intimate.
Last night it was a glorious rainbow over London when we were preparing for today, and today it's a sunny day in September, and crowds really have come out in their many thousands. And the sunshine has added to the sense of colour and vibrancy. It's been solid but not gloomy. This is the issue, because, as so many people have said, a life of 96 years is something to be celebrated. Of course, the Queen will be missed, but people understand that there's a lot here that needs to be said about everything that was achieved over that long lifetime. And that's really why I think that people have wanted to come out. It's a mark of thanks as well, not just of admiration. It's saying thank you as well as farewell.
It is, Hugh, and I suspect had it been pouring with rain, everyone that's standing out there today would still have done it in all weather.
It would be very British.
It would be terribly British, but I think the fact that as the coffin left the Abbey and the clouds parted and the sun came down, it was a wonderful moment to see that spectacle bathed in sunshine. And those rainbows that you point out, I think, struck so many people. The double rainbow over Buckingham Palace, the rainbow over Windsor Castle. I think we'll all be looking out for a rainbow later on today.
Indeed we will. And as you were saying, Robert, we're in a position where we are reflecting what's gone on today, but of course we're also looking ahead to the final part of this state funeral. And these people are clearly out to say goodbye and thank you for all you've done.
They are, and here we see Her late Majesty coming past the memorial to Prince Albert, that extraordinary memorial, 150 years old this year, the Albert Memorial, which Queen Victoria spent so much love on. I mean, it makes you think, what on earth are we going to put up to commemorate this extraordinary monarch who is leaving the capital for the last time? But you know, everything about today, there was a sort of timelessness to it. I thought you saw all the troops massing in front of Wellington's old house at Hyde Park Corner. It sort of could have been the 19th century. I mean, and yet we have all these sort of modern aspects to it. It's been a brilliant blend of ancient and modern today, and there is 21st century Britain saluting really one of the greats.
It's a wonderful parallel, isn't it, to be passing the Royal Albert Hall, because of course all those years that the Queen was determined to attend the Festival of Remembrance on Remembrance Weekend, the eve of the Remembrance service at the Cenotaph. The buzz among 5,000 people in that hall when she arrived at just before 7 o'clock on Saturday evening was remarkable, with people really feeling that the Queen's authority and the Queen's blessing on what was happening was indispensable. It wasn't the same event, and isn't the same event, won't be the same event without her, although of course the King will, and already has impressed lots of people with the way that he's...
Everyone wanted an imprimatur on these events. And wasn't it wonderful the way the procession took in almost all the great memorials, all the way through, not just the Cenotaph and the Women at War, but up to Hyde Park Corner. There's the New Zealand War Memorial, the Australian War Memorial. I mean, every aspect of shared sacrifice, I think, has been recognised today through this exemplary procession.
I was really struck as well, Katie, by the way in which the procession, the initial procession, which arrived at the Abbey in silence, a sense of expectation but deep respect. The service itself really did underline lots of the themes that Her Majesty wanted to have underlined. She was, of course, a woman of strong faith.
She was.
It had informed lots of the decisions that she'd made in her life and the way that she'd lived her life.
I think you're absolutely right, and we saw the faith reflected in that service with some of her favourite hymns.
Yes.
Readings that date back to the coronation. There was everything had been so carefully considered and thought out, and punctuated with the most important things in her life: her faith, the armed forces, her family, her people. It's all there, and I think also that sense that yes, we have lost something very, very special to all of us. This is a testimony to that. But in all of this, as Robert says, the tradition and the history and the landmarks and everything that's wrapped into this is the promise of the new. It's the continuity. We've seen that in the past 11 days, extraordinary days, and how the new king has been welcomed. But we saw that in the procession with Prince George and Princess Charlotte. That promise of the future, that promise of what's next to come. And I think that's reassuring, particularly at the moment,
Yes.
The presence of Princess Charlotte there, a reminder of some of the extraordinary changes that the late Queen made during her reign. I mean, it was only in 2011 she changed hundreds, thousands of years of male primogeniture, so that, you know, the line of succession has changed. All these little, that's so much. I mean, when historians look back on this reign, they'll see so many small ways in which, very quietly but very firmly, she completely transformed this institution. And I also love the way today that the procession, it wasn't just about recognising her. I mean, obviously, clearly it was, but in her way, when she organised it, she wanted to recognise others. I thought the way in which she placed the Victoria Cross and the George Cross holders right at the front of that procession, for example, that was so her. You know, the George Cross, the great decoration invented by her father at the height of the war. You know, all these little things. There's a lot of nods, I think, to her parents in that.
And to the Commonwealth, Mounties. I mean, it was all there, down to the NHS workers and everyone that helped us through the pandemic.
Most recent recipients of the George Cross, of course, the NHS.
A last word then from us before we go to our colleagues at Windsor for the next phase of the day. And Katie, you first of all. It's impossible to start really assessing neatly and credibly this remarkable reign so early on. Distinguished authors both, it's a challenge to do something like that. Do you feel that today will have helped people maybe turn the page, to just realise that great change is happening?
Yes.
And that they can take that on board? Is today the day when people will be helped in that direction?
I think so. I think this is the moment that completes 11 extraordinary days, and you could plan and rehearse and dress rehearse and do it all over again. You couldn't predict how the public were going to respond, what the mood would be. It's been phenomenal, but this is closure today, and I think back to what the Queen said in her very first broadcast when she was a little girl during the Blitz. All will be well, because it will.
Robert, is today the day when that happens? Because it's been 10 days of people really trying to come to terms with such a momentous change in public life and in personal lives.
I think what we've seen today, we have seen the embodiment of greatness from the world leaders gathered to what we're seeing now, an entire nation coming out. This is greatness in our time, and that greatness is really down to this extraordinary monarch, her life shaped by three people in particular: her father, her darling father, her beloved mother, and of course her beloved Philip. And I just think it is so powerful that here she is, she's on her way, and after all this grandeur and greatness, tonight she'll be reunited with them for eternity.
Well, we are looking at the progress of the procession of the State Hearse to Windsor, to the royal town of Windsor, where the final committal will take place a little later this afternoon, and our coverage continues. We will be following the journey, Queen's last journey out of London, to her home at Windsor Castle, and then we'll be following the new procession that will take place at Windsor, and of course the service at St. George's Chapel. And as we look at the vehicles making their way, and the State Hearse in particular, we can see the bright colours of the Royal Standard and the crown and the orb and sceptre, telling everyone along the way that this is Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, a Christian of conviction who, more than anyone, understood the message of the preacher, which is that there is a time and season to all things, a time to be born and a time to die. Queen understood that as part of the natural rhythm of life and the natural transition of the great constitution that she's upheld over many, many years. She's returning home to Windsor. Let's join Kirsty Young.
Yes, and so the grand and exquisite ceremonial tableau of that magnificent state occasion gently recedes into the background as the Queen's coffin makes its way now through London and out towards Windsor. Welcome to the splendour of Windsor Castle, the near 1,000-year-old home of royalty and the backdrop to many great battles and grand banquets. But today, sees maybe its most momentous event, the burial of our longest reigning monarch, Queen Elizabeth II. The Queen will this afternoon finally be laid to rest in St George's Chapel alongside her beloved parents, sister and husband. So many days of grand public ceremony will come to an intimate ending as Her Majesty passes into history. We'll see the Queen's coffin making its journey towards Windsor and the committal service, which will be attended by the King, the rest of the royal family, and also Her Majesty's closest friends. Windsor Castle is certainly exquisitely grand and imposing, but it's also a place where the Queen, and then of course the little princess, played as a toddler on the lawn, found safety as a teenager during the Blitz, rode her ponies, nursed her children, walked her dogs. Having left her cherished home in the Scottish Highlands 11 days ago, today she will come to rest for eternity in the home that was so important it gave name to her family. Well, the town of Windsor is, of course, a major tourist destination. It's used to crowds, but today its streets have taken on a unique character. The grounds of the chapel and the edges of the Long Walk are carpeted with bouquets of flowers. And the thousands of visitors, some local and many more from far-flung corners of the globe, are quietly positioning themselves to take one last look at Her Majesty's coffin. David Dimbleby will be taking us through this afternoon's event.
I suppose the way to see this afternoon's service is that if what happened at Westminster Abbey was the grandeur of a state funeral with heads of state, with people from all over the world coming to pay tribute to Her late Majesty, what is going to happen here at Windsor this afternoon is much closer to a family funeral. As Kirsty was saying, the Queen is going to be interred here along with the Queen Mother, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, Princess Margaret, and will lie with 10 other sovereigns going way back to Henry VI in 1471. So it is in that sense the sovereign coming back to the place where our sovereigns, or many of our sovereigns, lie. But on the other hand, the congregation is going to be very different here, as the people sitting here now, perfectly obvious, were not in Westminster Abbey. They've assembled here, and they are a different kind of congregation, much smaller. They include, for instance, many of the Queen's godchildren. They include large numbers of people who worked on the Queen's estates, whether in Scotland or in Norfolk or in London. Some of them wearing, you see that little medal, the Royal Victorian Order, which several people here are wearing, and that's the order that's in the personal gift of the Queen, only given to people who have worked for her, and it's her decision whether they should have it. So what we'll see here is a quite different service, but with this momentous ending to it, which Hugh was talking about earlier on, the moment when the instruments of monarchy that were presented to her in Westminster Abbey at the coronation are removed from the top of the coffin and returned to those 3 cushions you can just see in the far distance on the altar of St George's Chapel. The banners, of course, here are of the Royal Order of the Garter, hanging splendidly all the way down. The Garter Knights, who each have to provide the banner, there are 24 of them in all, and members of the royal family as well. So this chapel not only serves the purpose of being the Chapel of Windsor, but also of the Order of the Garter, founded in 1348 by Edward III. So history here, just as in Westminster Abbey, history here is present for this momentous afternoon.
Well, I'm joined now in our studio by the very well-known face, the gardener and broadcaster Alan Titchmarsh. Thank you very much for taking the time, especially since this is a personal day for you too, because you knew the Queen, you met her on very many occasions. What are your thoughts today as you've watched, as we've all watched, almost spellbound by some of those images?
I've been so moved, Kirsty, by the fact that we've all come together, as she said we would, and we must. And there's been this enormous sense of togetherness created for us by our late Majesty, the Queen. And the fact that the streets were so lined, that the Westminster Abbey was full of the great and the good, but we were there too, in spirit and in many thousands in person. And she has pulled us all together over the years, and I've felt also an enormous sense of continuity. We all thought, oh my goodness me, what will happen when the Queen goes? The Queen is gone, and yet we're still here. She would have wanted us to be. We now have a king who has taken up the reins seamlessly, spoken beautifully right the way through, and I feel safe. I feel as though we've all come together to say we're all right, you know, it will be okay. She gave us 70 years on the throne. We've learned from her. We will not disappoint her. We will carry on, we will be positive, and we will remember her with enormous fondness and respect.
I was wondering what you were making of, to me, although of course a state occasion, and indeed there will never be a grander one than that, but I was looking at the wreath on the coffin, so full of colour. I saw rosemaries, hydrangeas, there were dahlias, oak leaves. It seemed to me it was a very, very personal touch, and I just wondered, you, with your gardener's eye, what you made of that.
Our history was in that wreath. There were oak leaves there. There are oak trees in Windsor Great Park that were growing here and were mature when William the Conqueror invaded in 1066. Some of them are still there, still alive. And it's Hearts of Oak, isn't it, that famous military song? The oak leaves, rosemary, as you say, for remembrance, English roses. And the Prince of Wales, as you know, as I know, is a great gardener. And it was his wreath there, his message on there to his mother, who was also a keener gardener than most people would realise.
I didn't know that. I didn't know
she loved small flowers. Lily of the Valley was her favourite flower. She loved primroses. The sort of humble flowers, in a way, rather like Queen Alexandra, who was Edward VII's queen. She liked what she called her poor little flowers, really small little flowers. And it was a great reminder that one of the lasting great legacies from the Queen was the Queen's green canopy.
Yes.
That carries on. It is of small consolation to me that the first words my sovereign ever spoke to me in 1985 at the Chelsea Flower Show, when I did a cottage garden, she said to me, first time she'd ever spoken, I'd ever met her, she said, your onions are very small. And she must have seen I was crestful. She went on to say, I like them small. When they're large, they taste of nothing at all.
She's quite right. Bracingly frank then. What about what she gave you your MBE when you got your MBE? And people always say, well, you know, I don't really talk about what she said. Well, maybe now, maybe today is the day to talk about what she said. Well, what was the conversation?
Well, I'd have the great joy. It was 2000. It was the millennium, New Year on us, and I'd been given the MBE. And in that January, when I knew I'd got it, I was asked to go to Sandringham to talk to the Sandringham WI. Only about 25 members, and the Queen in the front row. And I remember standing up to address this AGM. The Queen was right in front of me, and I said, oh man, we're awfully close, aren't we? And so she took over the table, the trestle table, and she said, yes, you pull, I'll push. And we moved it. And then I had a lovely time. You know, when you can make the Queen laugh, or when you could make the Queen laugh, and she threw her head back, it was genuine laughter, and the smile that we all know. And then when I came to my investiture in June, I thought, well, I wonder if she'll say anything about it. And I went up to my bow, and she said, are you busy? And I thought, I was a bit disappointed, you know, it was a bit general, but I thought, no, she sees a lot of people, she can't remember everything. And I told her what I was doing, television and writing. And at the end, the hand came out, and as she shook my hand, she said, well, she said, you give a lot of ladies a lot of pleasure.
She never did.
Well, I didn't really realise until somebody said to me, so what did she say? And I said, she said, what? And so I was going home in the car with my wife, and I said, you know, I couldn't make up my mind whether to be buried or cremated. I'd quite like to be buried because I'd like a headstone. And on me said, like Alan Titchmarsh, MBE, 1949 to whatever. He gave a lot of ladies a lot of pleasure, Elizabeth R.
Well, she wasn't wrong, was she, Alan?
No.
Extraordinarily, you saw, as he was then, Prince Charles, the night before he was about to become king. A normal night, a special night? It must have presumably been a special night. Prince Charles was there.
It was at Dumfries House, up in Ayrshire, and I've been an ambassador for the Princess Trust and the Princess Countryside Fund for a long time. I've also been, since its formation, an ambassador for the Princess Foundation, which does a huge amount of work, and particularly up in that part of Scotland and around Dumfries House. 12,000 people a year learning all kinds of skills. And I was up there to have a look round, and I saw the Prince in the morning and ran across from Blackdown and said hello, and we had a quick chat, and he said, you know, perhaps you could do the estate walk with me tomorrow, which, as it turned out, I couldn't do, but it's another story, isn't it? But we had a dinner in the evening, and it was about 50 people there, so it was quite intimate. And after dinner, we had coffee, and we listened to music. There was a sort of penny whistle and a guitar, and the Prince gave the penny whistle player a bottle of scotch and the guitarist a bottle of champagne. And we all chatted, and at about 11 o'clock, the Prince was working his way around the room to leave. And I happened to be standing by the door, and he shook my hand. He said, "Come for tea sometime." And I said, "Look, I've known him for a long time." And off he went to bed, and off I went to bed, and I got an early flight in the morning. When I got home, I realised that I'd said goodnight to the King on his last night as Prince of Wales. He had no inkling that night before that anything was untoward.
We're looking at pictures now of the Queen's coffin making its way, as I said, towards Windsor, and we can see there's hardly, well, there isn't a gap, really. People have come out from their homes, their places of work, if they happen to be working today on this bank holiday, and they are very much making their presence felt. And I think, well, we saw how deep the crowds were in central London. It's no surprise.
It's no surprise at all. It's wonderful that people want to be there, as all those hundreds of thousands who filed through Westminster Hall just wanted to be there, to pay their respects, to say thank you. It's a celebration of a life, as well as a mourning of a passing of a very, very important person to all of us.
Alan Titchmarsh, thank you very much for sharing your wonderful memories and your thoughts on such an important day.
Thank you.
People are gathering on the long walk. Anita Rani is there for us.
I was here last night, Kirsty, and a few people were gathering to bag their spots, to spend their night under the stars, to make sure that they got a good position. And what a difference now. The crowds have amassed, all here with one common goal: to witness a moment in history, to watch the procession of Her Majesty the Queen's coffin make the final part of its journey along the Long Walk through to Windsor Castle via the Cambridge Gate, which is behind me. The crowds have come well prepared. They've come with picnics and blankets and chairs, and they've been watching the funeral service on screens that have been erected along the Long Walk. And during the service, it was pin drop silence, and then everybody rose to their feet during the national anthem. The atmosphere here is calm, it's contemplative, it's reflected, it's very peaceful. And the weather gods are smiling on us today. It was warm and overcast this morning, and now the sun has come out. And the people here are from all over the country, all walks of life, young and old, and locals from Windsor as well. Some of them who were lucky enough to meet the Queen, who was very much their neighbour, and I'll be hearing their stories a little bit later.
With me now, watching events unfold today, is the very eminent historian, Sir David Cannadine. We're very happy to have you here. Why Windsor? Why does it end here for Queen Elizabeth II?
It ends here because Windsor is the oldest residence, royal residence of the royal family, going back to Norman times. And more recently, and there's a long perspective here, it's the place where all British monarchs have been buried since George III. Most of them, not all of them, in the chapel here, but all of them within the wider curtilage of Windsor. So it is the place where monarchs finally come to rest, and in the sequence of monarchs, it's now Queen Elizabeth's turn.
Can we draw any conclusions from the fact? I think people very often, when they visit Windsor, when they think of Windsor, they think of Queen Victoria. They see the wonderful statue that's in the centre of Windsor, and of course the mausoleum is here, this grand mausoleum that was built near Frogmore Cottage. Yes, yeah. Near Frogmore. Our longest-serving monarch of 70 years doesn't seem to be doing anything that is quite as much of a statement as that. She will be laid to rest in the very intimate privacy of the family crypt. That tells us something about, or does it tell us something about her?
Well, Windsor Castle is a very multifunctional place. It's important to remember that. It began as a fortress. It's a royal home. It's where many members of the royal household work. It has a fabulous library and art collection, and it's a place of worship. So lots of things go on in Windsor, but one of the great things that goes on, which is why we're here today, is that this is where monarchs end their lives and are buried here. Queen Elizabeth, of course, herself had a strong personal connection with Windsor, probably stronger than many monarchs before her. So there are many reasons why it's very fitting that she ends here.
Do you think the strong connection particularly being the teenage years during the war, which really sort of cemented, would it be fair to say, cemented her relationship with the place?
I think it would. Of course, even before that, she spent weekends and time at Royal Lodge when her father was Duke of York, and that's where she acquired her love of country living and dogs and horses. But then, of course, she did live here with Princess Margaret during the Second World War. She made her first broadcast from here, and I think that was a very influential phase in her life. When she became monarch, she spent weekends here during the time that she was at Buckingham Palace during the week, and a variety of events are built around Windsor, the Garter ceremony, for example, Ascot Week, and of course a great deal of royal pageantry goes on here, state occasions when she welcomed people like President Obama or Donald Trump or Joe Biden. So she was very closely associated with here during her very long reign.
Can we think then about today as the moment when the Queen slips from being the person who was our monarch into history, as it were? You know, she is somebody who people will now be reading about. That's a very significant moment, of course, for her family and friends, but in a way it's a shared moment for all of us.
Yes, I think that's right, and in a way it's a moment that will actually linger. It is true that she is passing from being our queen, and most of us never knew the time when there was any other monarch. She has now passed into history. We have a new sovereign, King Charles III. But of course it's true, firstly, that I think many people will remember this day all their lives, but secondly, it's going to take quite a while for my colleagues, historians and biographers, to reach some settled verdict on many aspects of her reign. We know already it was a remarkable reign. She was a great monarch and was much loved. All of that we know and is settled. But how future generations, future historians will come to see her is, I think, something that will need a lot of work on going forward.
It is very interesting that she maintained entirely consistently, as I understand it, the popularity of the monarchy throughout her reign. The figures were always the same. You know, people very much liked her when she came to the throne and very much like her today. It's interesting that as times have changed, and in many ways she was a monarch managing decline of an empire, decline of Britain's status in the world in so many ways, and yet every overseas paper that I got my hands on this morning, on its very front page was the fact that today was the state funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. It's interesting that there's a sort of tension between those two things, do you think?
Yes, I think that's right. It's clear that in many ways she presided over a period of de-imperialisation, for want of a better word.
It's a good word.
And de-Victorianisation, if you'd like that one as well. And part of her skill at managing that was that she never let on that that was what she was doing.
Yes.
And I think that was crucially important. Yet at the same time as those things were happening, she helped the monarchy adapt. Some thought too slowly, some thought too quickly. I think on the whole she called it right. And I think the recognition that she managed to sustain all of that over 70 years was a very extraordinary achievement. Just as is also the fact that, although we like to think to the contrary, over 70 years she sustained the fact that with very, very few exceptions, we never really knew what she thought about anything.
Isn't that true? And that's so often when I speak to people, indeed at the Jubilee I spoke to many people to try to get an insight, but I suppose it's understandable that somebody who was so constantly under scrutiny would want very firmly to keep part of their life private.
I think that's right, and the hope must be, I speak here of course as a historian, the hope must be that she did indeed keep a diary, which I think there is cause to suppose that she did, and let us hope that she expressed her views there trenchantly and candidly in a way that in public she very properly felt she couldn't.
So interesting to talk to you, Sir David Cannadine. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to share your thoughts with us.
It's been a great pleasure and privilege.
Thank you.
On its way from London to Windsor, the coffin of the Queen carried past large crowds on each side of the road here. Quite extraordinary that in the centre of London people were kept away from the procession. They're making up